The flight was boarding like any other, until a quiet argument near the first-class aisle made heads turn. A single dad in a worn jacket stood frozen, holding a small backpack, his young daughter gripping his hand. He was a janitor, traveling for the first time by plane, and somehow, his ticket placed him in first class. But the whispers started quickly. Other passengers complained, a flight attendant hesitated, and within moments, he was asked to leave his seat, his face burning with embarrassment as his daughter looked up at him, confused and scared. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded, picked up his bag, and prepared to walk away, used to being judged and overlooked. But as he stepped into the aisle, something unexpected happened. The cockpit door opened, and the pilot glanced out just for a second. What he saw made him stop cold. This story isn't just about a first-class seat or a flight delay. It's about dignity, sacrifice, and the hidden lives people carry with them. It's about a single father doing his best, and a moment that would change everything for everyone on that plane. As the pilot stared at the man in the aisle, the cabin fell silent, because this was the moment no one saw coming. The pilot didn't say a word at first. He just stood there, studying the man in the aisle as if trying to place a memory that refused to stay buried. The single dad shifted uncomfortably, assuming he had done something wrong. He gently pulled his daughter closer, whispering that everything was fine, even though his own hands were shaken. Around them, the cabin felt tense, filled with judgment and quiet curiosity. Minutes earlier, that man had been cleaning office floors on the night shift, saving every spare dollar for this trip. He wasn't flying for comfort or status. He was flying because this was the only chance he had left. His daughter's small backpack held more than clothes. It held medical papers, hope, and a deadline he couldn't miss. First class was never his plan, just a mix-up he didn't know how to fix. The pilot's eyes dropped to the worn shoes, the tired face, then to the little girl, holding tight, trying to be brave. Something about this scene clearly struck a nerve. His expression changed, not with anger, but with shock and uncertainty. Behind him, the crew waited for instructions. Passengers leaned forward, sensing something bigger was unfolding. The father swallowed hard, ready to apologize again, unaware that the pilot was staring because he recognized something from years ago that refused to be forgotten. And before anyone could move, the pilot took one slow step closer. The pilot stopped just a few steps away, close enough for the single dad to notice the man's breath catch. For a moment, their eyes met, and the dad felt a strange sense of being seen, not judged, but truly noticed. Still, he lowered his gaze out of habit. Years of working as a janitor had taught him that staying quiet made problems pass faster. In the first-class seats, reactions were mixed. Some passengers looked uncomfortable, others annoyed by the delay. One woman glanced at the little girl and softened, while a man across the aisle shook his head, impatient to take off. The flight attendant hovered nearby, unsure whether to intervene or wait. This wasn't in the manual. The daughter tugged at her father's sleeve and whispered if they were in trouble. He smiled gently and told her no, even though his chest felt tight. This flight meant everything. Missing it could mean losing the appointment he had waited months for, the one that might finally change their future. The pilot cleared his throat, but still didn't speak. His eyes kept returning to the man's face, as if comparing it to a memory that wouldn't line up. Years ago, another airport, another moment of desperation flashed through his mind. He turned briefly toward the cockpit, conflicted, then back again. The cabin remained frozen in uncertainty, unaware that this chance encounter was pulling two very different lives toward a collision neither of them expected. The pilot finally spoke, but his voice was low and careful, asking the single dad for his name. The question alone made the cabin buzz. The father answered quietly, confused by the attention, while keeping one hand on his daughter's shoulder. The pilot repeated the name under his breath, as if testing it against the past, and his face tightened with emotion he struggled to hide. The flight attendant glanced between them, sensing this was no longer about a seating issue. The delay stretched on, and murmurs spread through first class and beyond the curtain. Some passengers checked their watches, others leaned closer, pulled in by the tension. No one knew why the pilot hadn't asked security to step in, or why the cockpit door was still open. The father's thoughts raced. If they were removed from the flight, there was no backup plan. The money was gone. The time was gone. His daughter squeezed his hand harder, sensing his fear, even though he tried to stay calm. He reminded himself to breathe, to stay steady for her. The pilot's eyes drifted once more to the little girl, then back to the worn face he couldn't forget. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Whatever memory had been triggered, it clearly mattered. Then the pilot reached into his pocket and said something that made the flight attendant freeze, and the entire cabin held its breath. The pilot slowly pulled out an old, folded photograph instead of an ID or document. His hands trembled slightly as he looked from the picture to the single dad standing in the aisle. The image showed a much younger man, exhausted, holding a newborn outside a small airport terminal. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. A quiet gasp escaped the pilot before he could stop it. The father frowned, clearly confused, while the flight attendant leaned in, her expression changing the moment she saw the photo. This was no longer a routine delay. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, as if everyone sensed a truth on the edge of being revealed. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Realizing something deeply personal was unfolding in front of them, the pilot asked one more careful question. His voice tight, about a night years ago when someone had helped him without asking for anything in return. The single dad's eyes narrowed slightly, searching his memory, but he shook his head. His life had been full of long nights and forgotten moments. He had helped many strangers, never expecting recognition. The little girl looked up at the pilot and spoke softly, asking why everyone was staring at her dad. That simple question hit harder than any accusation. The pilot swallowed hard, torn between duty and something that felt unfinished. Outside the cockpit, a senior crew member approached, asking if they needed to clear the aisle. The pilot hesitated because if he answered, everything might change. The pilot finally spoke clearly, his voice steady but full of emotion. Years ago, he explained, his life had fallen apart after a long shift and a missed connection. Stranded at a nearly empty airport, overwhelmed and ready to give up. He had met a janitor who stayed late to clean the terminal. That man had listened, shared a coffee, and reminded him why he became a pilot in the first place. He never got the man's name, only remembered his face. And now, standing in the aisle, he was looking at him again. The cabin went silent. The flight attendant wiped her eyes as the pilot thanked the single dad, right there in front of everyone. He apologized for the misunderstanding and firmly told the crew that the man and his daughter would remain in first class. A few passengers looked ashamed. Others nodded quietly, as if something important had just settled into place. As they prepared for takeoff, the father finally relaxed, holding his daughter close. But just as the plane began to move, the pilot leaned down and asked about the medical papers in the backpack. When he heard where they were going, his expression changed again. Because the hospital they were flying to wasn't just any hospital. It was the one where his sister worked, in the very department that could change that little girl's life forever. The rest of the flight passed in a quiet, thoughtful calm. The pilot kept his promise, speaking to his sister before they landed and making sure the single dad and his daughter were expected when they arrived. There were no miracles in the air, just small acts of care lining up at the right moment. When the plane touched down, the father felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: relief, mixed with hope. At the hospital, the process moved faster than he imagined. Appointments that once took months were suddenly within reach. The little girl smiled more that day than she had in weeks, and that alone made the journey worth it. The pilot didn't ask for thanks. He said this was simply a debt finally being returned. Before they parted ways, the father looked back at the plane and thought about how close he had come to missing it all. A single misunderstanding, a quiet judgment, could have changed everything. Instead, kindness found its way back to him when he needed it most. This wasn't a story about first class or status. It was about dignity, compassion, and how unseen lives often carry the biggest impact. Sometimes, the smallest moments: clean floors, shared coffee, a child's hand can circle back and change a future forever.